Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me as we today are going to pass from chapter 3 and begin looking at chapter 4 of First Peter. And one of the things that is really an obvious indicator in the passage is where in verse 1, the very first word we see is therefore. And that really is an indication that we're now at a transitional point, that the conversation is going to move from one point to another. So in many ways, previous to this, Peter was talking about some of the doctrinal implications of being baptized, the importance of it, the role it plays in our life as believers, that if you're a Christian and a true believer in Jesus and you've never been baptized, it's a point of obedience. I'm not saying that you aren't saved. I'm just saying you're not being obedient to this area of your life. And the reason I even share that is because over the years, I've talked with many people who have been Christians for a very long time, and they admitted to me that they'd never gotten baptized. Most of them, some people because they're terrified of immersion, the idea of being put underwater, which is the biblical model. The idea of sprinkling, or what we often call dry cleaning, isn't a biblical example, so we don't do it, but simply because it's not the way it's done within Scripture. It's always that bapto, that lowering into the water, the full immersion, that submersion into water. And I've known people who are afraid of that. They have some kind of a phobia about water, and I get it. I just encourage them to face that fear and overcome that fear in faith towards Christ as being a real act of faith. I'm going to allow myself to be immersed even though it terrifies me. And I'm always so impressed when I find people who say, I'm going to do that. Even though this may be one of the scariest things I've ever faced, I'm going to do it anyway because I know I need to do it in faithful confession of Christ. And as I shared before, I think it's really about letting other people know about your devotion. And think about it. If you have friends and relatives who know you're terrified of water, and yet you tell them, I'm being baptized, and once you come to the baptism and be a witness of that experience, especially unsaved people, don't you think that that would really say something to them, how serious this is to you and how willing you are to bring your life into agreement with God's will for your life? So if you haven't been baptized, I would encourage you to do that. Other people I've talked to said, well, I don't like to be in front of people. I'm embarrassed that because of my size, my figure, my body, and other things, and I don't want to be publicly on display. I would say in some ways it's the same issue for you, that these are fears that keep us from doing what we need to do. And this is what Satan loves. He loves to use fear to get us to stop doing what we need to do, or to just continue to ignore something that we know God wants us to do. And that begins to multiply itself. That's the danger of fears in our life, that any fear we have not only hinders us from doing something, but it tends to metastasize into other areas of your life. I know of people who struggle with things like agoraphobia. They're afraid to go outside. And this started as something very small where they began to restrict their movements and their activities, but has grown to a point where they can't even leave the house. And until you begin to realize that this is a tool of the enemy, this is something that Satan is using to harass and to hinder you, it's going to continue to increase its bondage in your life. And I would say simply, simply say, if you're afraid to go outside, I'm going to drag you out and make you face the sun. No, but what I would say is, why don't you even now start praying and saying, Lord, I know this is a problem. I don't think I can overcome it. I'm asking you to help me overcome it. Help me overcome my fear. Because I'm like you. There are things that I have been afraid of in my life, and they've held me captive until I've been willing to just face up to them, and it opened up whole new avenues for me. You might find this hard to believe, but public speaking was something that I was pretty terrified of before I was saved. I did not enjoy it and did not look for the opportunity. I like to, stay in the back of the crowd so I wouldn't be focused on and wouldn't have people being able to, put their scope on me, put me in their crosshairs. Well, it's you can tell I'm a long ways from that at this point in my life. But I just remember the first time I was asked to give a Bible study, and man, I tell you, I think I was leaking out of every orifice in my body. I wanted to vomit. I had nausea. I had diarrhea. I was just terrified. And I finally just said, okay, Lord, I'm just going to make a fool of myself, and I'm just going to go there. And it was profound because God met me in that moment, used me to speak life into other people's lives, some people gave their life to the Lord, which was shocking to me. And I realized at that moment that I had burst through a barrier that had been holding me back. And it really began to open the door for what became really the path that has marked my life ever since, doing things like this. So I don't know what it is in your life, but I know that we all have something. And I think part of that is where we begin by saying, God, I just want to do your will, and I want to trust you. And that's why I think it's interesting that where in verse 1, Peter begins to move into the issue of suffering, which is really one of the main themes of this letter, because as he's writing it, he's writing to people who are beginning to feel the ire and the opposition of the world around them. Not only had many of the Christians suffered at the hands of Jews who resented Christianity as being a competitive religious system, many of them viewed it as being just rank heresy. And if you don't believe that, all you got to do is look at the book of Acts and especially see how Paul was treated, that it was the Jews at that time who were his primary persecutors. Later on, it metastasized into the government of Rome, which was more of what Peter is dealing with, because he himself ultimately, like Paul, was arrested and was executed by Nero because he was a Christian. And most believe it was an effort by Nero to simply find a foil that he could blame for the fire that destroyed 10 of the 14 quarters of the city of Rome at the time. This terrible fire in 64 AD, it killed, tens of thousands of people. In fact, it was the largest city in the world, and most of it, 10 districts out of 14, were completely burnt and decimated. Even the palace of the emperor was destroyed. And yet many people blamed Nero because he immediately began to seize property that had been vacated because of the fire that wasn't his. Many of those properties belonged to senators, and he began to build a palatial, what he called the Golden Palace. But that's more history than you may be interested in. But the whole point is that Peter was beginning to see this arm of the government beginning to reach out and grab hold of Christians and begin to punish them and treat them poorly. And so the topic of suffering and being prepared for it is central to the message that he has in this particular letter. Because he says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude. What do you mean by attitude? Well, that you should have this certain sense of expectation and the obligation to endure hardships as good soldiers of Jesus Christ, as Paul put it in his second letter to Timothy in the 2nd chapter. That the idea that suffering is not something that's strange or unusual or out of the character. It's not evidence that we've done something wrong, which is, basically many of those people from the Word Faith movement, the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth people have really taught for years that if you're faithful to God and have enough faith in God, that you're exempted from a lot of the sufferings and hardship. In fact, they even say Job suffered because he said, the thing I feared the most has come upon me. Well, the thing that Job feared the most was being displeasing to God. It wasn't suffering. And yet, when he went through suffering, he automatically began to really express the same theology the Word Faith people have, that if I'm doing good, why am I suffering? And that has become really one of the thematic questions that the book of Job has sought to answer, is that if righteous people are doing righteous things, why do they suffer at the hand of unrighteous people? Why are we subject to injustices and unfairnesses? And the simple fact is that it really is what God allows, kind of like we can look at the life of Joseph, and we like looking at his life because it was so bad, and in the end it became so magnificent. The same thing with Job. It was so bad until it became magnificent, super magnificent later on. And it's not necessarily a promise, because not everybody who suffers for Christ is going to be saved. I was just reading an article the other day where in Nigeria, there on average 4,000 Christians are murdered in Nigeria every year. And it's because it's a majority Muslim nation, and it's kind of like Christmas and Easter are open season upon Christians. And one of the things that Peter is saying to us is, when that happens, we have to understand that this is really what happened to Jesus. And we look at Jesus' death on the cross as being an example, because Jesus was the one who said in Matthew 16:24, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. And when he used the word cross, there was no mystery in the disciples' minds of what he was talking about. But he says the whole point is that he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. Well, let me tackle what that means tomorrow. Okay, thank you. We'll continue on. Blessings.